Verena Kessler stood at the Deshler County land office in the autumn of 1884, and the whole town had already decided she was finished. 58 years old. Widowed the winter before. The bank had taken the quarter she and her husband broke with their own hands. The clerk knew all of it. So when he slid the paper across the counter, a relinquishment on a black half-section, burnt ground nobody's name would touch, he watched her face, waiting for the flinch. She didn't flinch. There were a dozen men at that counter, and the clerk played to every one of them. He laughed. No man in the county would file on burnt ground, Mrs. Even the grasshoppers left it. The men laughed with him. And Verena laid down $9. Not the 14 the fee should have been. 9. Because the fire had knocked the price of that land down to nothing, and nothing was a thing she could afford. Then she walked out to the section line. She stooped. She ran a fistful of the black ash through her fingers, slow, like a woman counting coins. And she said not one word. Because every man at that counter had priced what he could see. Verena Kessler had priced what the fire left in the ground. If you believe old hands know things young eyes can't see, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe and tell me in the comments which state you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. They called her the Sunk Woman, that was the name, in the town of Corliss, and folks used it the way you'd name a broken wheel. The day the auctioneer read the notice on her husband's quarter, the whole county decided she was done. She stood at the back of that crowd, in a black dress with her hands folded, and she watched strangers bid on the barn her Anton had raised. She didn't cry. That was the part people talked about after. She didn't cry, and somehow that made it worse for them. A woman who cries you can pity. A woman who just watches, dry-eyed, unsettles a room. After the sale, she took a rented shack at the edge of town, 2 rooms and a stove that smoked, and she kept driving her wagon past the old place. Every week or so, she'd slow the horse at the fence line and just look at the ground. Not the house, the ground. People saw her do it and shook their heads. Poor sunk woman, they said, can't let go. They were wrong about what she was looking at. But nobody asked. There was a jar on her windowsill in that shack. A quart jar, full of gray-black ash. She'd carried it there herself, and she never explained it, and the one time the landlord's wife noticed and asked, Verena just said it kept the moths off. Which was a lie, and a poor one, and the woman let it go the way you let go of a strange old widow's habits. One morning she took coffee with Odell Brace's wife at the store, and she said a thing, offhand. The way you say a thing you've stopped thinking is remarkable. She said that back in the old country, her father burned the wheat stubble every fall, burned the whole field black before the snow, and she said the black strips, come spring, always came up the strongest, thickest heads, cleanest rows. She said it plain, buttering her bread, and Mrs. Brace nodded the way you nod at an old woman's story and changed the subject to her daughter's wedding. And that was that. The words fell on the table, and nobody picked them up. Remember them. The town forgot them by noon. That fall, a range fire came down through the North Townships. It ran for 2 days on a dry wind, and when it stopped, it had left a half-section burnt clean to the dirt. Black from fence to fence. The man who'd claimed it had already quit, filed his relinquishment, and gone east, glad to be shut of it, before the fire even came. So there it sat, dead-looking land, with no name on it. And the men in Corliss talked about it the way you'd talk about a grave. A shame. A waste. Land you couldn't give away. Verena heard them talking. And Verena went to the land office with $9 folded in a cloth. You've seen how that went. Hollis Prine, the clerk, made his joke about the grasshoppers, and the men laughed, and she paid her $9, and she signed her name in a steady hand. But there was one more thing Prine said, and he said it as she turned to go, loud enough for the room. "You bought a graveyard, Mrs." She stopped at the door. She didn't turn around. She just said, "We'll see what's buried in it." And she left them laughing. It should have ended there, a foolish old woman and a bad piece of dirt. But the county wasn't done with her yet. Word got around fast that the sunk woman had sunk her last $9 in the burnt half section, and it gave everyone something to chew on. A few days later, she came to the courthouse to file some small paper, and on the steps stood Cyrus Vane. Vane bought and sold land. He'd been the one who priced that section as dead in the first place, and he'd been glad to let it go for nothing. But now he'd heard she wanted it, and that made him wonder if he'd missed something. Not in the soil. He never thought about the soil. But in the deal. So he offered her $11. 2 more than she'd paid. Right there on the steps, in front of the same men. "Take the mistake off your hands," he said, smiling, generous. "You'll not do better." And Verena Kessler, in front of the whole county, said no. That was the moment the town settled on its verdict. Not just sunk. Foolish. A woman who'd turned down a profit on a graveyard was a woman past saving. They had a name for her folly now, and they said it out loud, and they said it often. She rode home alone that evening. And near dusk, she drove her wagon out to the black section and got down and stood in the middle of all that ruin, and if you'd been standing on the road, you'd have seen exactly what they saw. A small woman, a dead field. Nothing, but here's what the men on the courthouse steps didn't know. Here's what Cyrus Vane, who priced land for a living, had never once considered. The fire hadn't taken from that ground. The fire had given to it. When grass and brush and stubble burn, they don't vanish. They come back down as ash, and ash is potash and phosphorus and lime. The very things a man pays good money to spread on a tired field. The fire had laid it down free, and it had laid it down even, across every acre, a gift no wagon of manure could match. That was the first thing. The second thing was the weeds. Every field carries a bank of weed seed in its top inch of soil, thousands of them, waiting. They're what choke a new stand and rob the wheat. But heat kills seed. That fire had run hot across the surface and scorched the top of that seed bank down to nothing. The weeds that would have fought her wheat were dead before she ever turned a furrow. And the third thing, the thing only a plow ever teaches you, was the litter. On unburned sod there's a mat of old grass roots and dead stalks, tangled and tough, and it fouls a breaking plow, catches on the share, tears instead of cutting. On the burnt ground that mat was gone, burned away. The sod would open clean behind the blade like a book falling open. Every man in that county had looked at black dirt and read death. Verena had grown up beside a father who burned his fields on purpose, and she read the same black dirt and knew exactly what it held. She went back to the fence line and ran the ash through her fingers one more time, and she nodded to herself, and she went home to sharpen her plowshare. She broke that sod alone. No hired man, no son, just Verena and one horse and a walking plow, day after day. And on the second morning, August Teller came and leaned on the fence of his own quarter next door to watch. Teller had the unburned ground, the good clean sod every man admired, and he considered himself the best wheat man in the county. He watched her struggle the plow around, and he called out, friendly as a knife, "You're plowing a stove. Verena, you'll wear out that horse turning ashes." She didn't answer him. She just kept walking the furrow, and if Teller had looked, really looked, the way a plowman looks, he'd have seen the share turning up clean black earth with no straw mat fighting it, curling over smooth and easy. The audience could see it. Teller couldn't. He saw a foolish old woman and a dead field, because that was the only picture he'd let himself hold. There was a corner of that section she worked first, and covered over careful, prepared early against the cold, the way an old hand gets the barn ready before the sky has even changed. Nobody asked about that either. By the time the freeze was near, she'd broken every acre. And then, on the last workable day before the ground locked hard, Verena Kessler sowed winter wheat into the burnt section. By drill and by hand, walking the rows, scattering the seed the old way in the places the drill couldn't reach. Alone. No speech. No scheme. She just did the work that not one soul in Corliss believed in, and she finished at last light, and she stood at the fence with an empty seed sack in her hand and looked out over ground that now held her whole year, her whole $9, and near everything she had left. Somewhere in town they were already saying it, laughing over their suppers, $9 in a graveyard. And the seed lay in the cold black earth, waiting for a spring nobody thought would come. Winter came down hard, and it did what winter does. It buried the black section under white and held it there. Nobody thought about the seed under the snow. Nobody but Verena. She kept the jar of ash on the windowsill through the cold months. Some evenings, she'd turn it in her hands, then set it back and go to bed. When the thaw came, she drove into Corliss for spring seed. She needed a little credit to carry her to harvest. Just a little. Odell Brace kept the store, and Brace kept the ledger of who a person was worth. She laid her list on the counter. Brace looked at it. Then he looked at her over his spectacles. "Not on that ground, Verena," he said. "I can't carry a woman farming a graveyard. You know I can't." She didn't argue. She folded the list back up and put it in her coat. "All right," she said. And she walked out with her chin level past the men by the stove who'd gone quiet to watch. By noon the whole town had it. $9 in a graveyard, and now she couldn't even get seed on credit for it. Mrs. Odell Brace told it 3 times before supper. She'd forgotten, clean forgotten, that Verena had once sat in her kitchen and told her about a father burning wheat stubble in the old country. That part fell out of the telling. Only the folly stayed in. Next door, August Teller drilled his clean quarter. Good sod, dark and unburned, the ground every man in the county admired. He worked it proud and easy. He had no straw mat to fight, because he'd never burned a thing in his life. His ground was the ground you were supposed to want. He watched Verena's black acres from his fence and shook his head like a man watching money get thrown down a well. "She'll learn," he told anybody who'd listen. "Ground's got a memory. You can't cheat it." And the viewer knew. The viewer held the thing the whole town had priced wrong. Under that black skin the ash lay spread across every acre, potash, phosphorus, lime, laid down free and even. The weed seed on top, burned dead. The mat that fouls a plow, gone, all of it waiting. But nobody in Corliss could see waiting. They could only see ruin. Then the spring turned dry. It came in hard and mean, week on week with no real rain, and the young stands went thin all over the county, thin on the good ground, thin on the poor, and thin, from the road, on Verena's burned section too. You couldn't tell yet. You couldn't tell a thing. And when a field looks the same as a failing field, the men who called it doomed feel proven right. Cyrus Vane felt it. He drove out to her one gray afternoon, sure now the folly had come due. He found her at the section line, standing at the fence, watching her own ground the way she always watched it. He didn't get down from the wagon. "Verena," he said, "easy, like a man doing a kindness. It's a dry year. That ground was never going to carry a crop, and you know it now same as I did then. I'll take the claim off you. Cheap, but it's cash in your hand today. More than you'll cut off it, I promise you that." She looked at him. Then she looked back at the field. "No," she said. That was all. No speech. Just her own 2 eyes on the wheat nobody else could read. Vane sat there a moment. Then he clicked to his horse and drove off. And he told himself she was a stubborn old fool who'd sunk her last dollar and was too proud to climb out. She'd spent near everything she had. The town knew that too. This was the low place. This was where a person breaks. She didn't break. She waited. And the ground kept its own counsel. And then, quiet, the way real things happen, the ground answered. It came through first, as a color, a green you could see from the road that once read only black. Then, the green thickened. Then, it stood. On the burned section, the winter wheat came up even and full, row on row, the whole half section carrying a stand so clean it looked drilled by a machine that never made a mistake. No weeds in it. Nothing to fight it. The old seed bank that chokes a field had burned dead in the fire, and every plant that came up was wheat and only wheat, feeding on ash spread free across every acre. Then you looked next door. August Teller's clean quarter, the good ground, the ground every man wanted, came up thin. It came up patchy and pale, and between the thin wheat came the weeds, thick as the crop. Thicker. The whole old seed bank of that unburned sod rising up green and hungry against him. The dry year hit him where he had no armor. And there was no hiding it, because the two fields lay side by side along the same fence, and the difference was plain as a line drawn on the ground. The ruined half stood tall. The good half struggled. You could see it from the road. From the very road that had carried all that laughter. Word travels a farming county fast when a field does something it isn't supposed to. By first cutting, in July, the same men who'd stood at that land office counter came riding out along the property line to see it with their own eyes. Verena was in the field. She stood in wheat to her waist, gold and even, and clean as far as a man could look. And she had a sickle in her hand because she meant to cut the first sheaf herself, by hand, the old way. Hollis Prine rode out with them. The clerk who'd slid the relinquishment across the counter and laughed. The man who read dirt by its color and thought color was knowledge. He sat his horse at the fence and looked at that stand of wheat, and he did not laugh now. He didn't say one word. There was nothing in his mouth to say. Verena bent and cut the first sheaf. She straightened, and she bound it, and she held it a moment in the sun. Then she looked out at all of them along the fence, not at any one man, at all of them. The fire didn't take one thing that ground would miss, she said, dry as a bone. And she turned back to her work. August Teller was there too, and Teller couldn't meet her eye. He stood at the corner where his fence met hers, his own thin weed-run quarter behind him, and the best wheat man in the county looked at his boots. He'd said the ground had a memory. He'd been right. He just never understood whose ground remembered what. His remembered every weed. Hers had been wiped clean and fed. He didn't say she'll learn anymore. He didn't say anything. He walked back toward his house with his shoulders down, past a stand of wheat that shamed his own within sight of it. And Odell Brace who'd folded up her list and told her not on that ground, Brace came out to her wagon that same week. He stood there turning his hat in his hands. "Verena," he said. "About the seed. Whatever you need this fall, your credit's good at my counter." "Always was." I misspoke. She looked at him a while. "I've got cash this fall, Mr. Brace," she said, "but thank you." And that was worse for him than if she'd cursed him. Cyrus Vane came last, and this time he got down from his wagon. He came with real money in his coat, a serious number, the kind he'd never have breathed over a graveyard. He named it standing at her fence. "You priced it dead," she said before he could finish. "You let it go for nothing, because the fire took away the only thing your eye knew how to read." "I'm not selling it, Mr. Vane, not this year." The man who'd called it a graveyard now stood at that fence, naming it gold. She didn't need his number. She'd known the number the day she laid down her $9, because none of this was luck. Understand that. She'd been warned off it. She'd been laughed at across a counter, jeered from a fence, refused at a store. She'd broken every acre of that section alone, with one horse and a walking plow, when not a soul would lend a hand. The wheat standing to her waist was not a gift from a kind spring. It was the exact return of a thing she alone had known was lying there under the black. She'd priced what the fire left in the ground. Every other man had priced what he could see. She threshed that autumn and sold the crop at the season's price. A full crop, clean grain, off ground the county had buried before she ever put a plow to it. And she took the margin, the whole first-year margin off $9, and she bought a piece of ground near the quarter she and Anton had broken together, the one the bank took the winter he died. She knew what she was doing. She'd tell you plain, if you asked. The Burns gift fades. That much ash feeds hard the first season, softer the second, and by the third the ground is just ground again. She never expected, but the one clean year. One clean year was all she'd ever asked of it, and one clean year was all she needed to get her feet back under her on land of her own. She took the last jar of ash off the windowsill and carried it out to the new ground, and she opened her hand and scattered it across the furrows, gray-black, the way her father had done it in a country she'd left a lifetime ago. She saw Prine once more, that fall, in the store. The clerk who'd said you bought a graveyard, Mrs., he didn't quite know where to look. She stopped by him on her way out. Ruin and readiness look the same from the road, Mr. Prine, she said. I only had to be the one holding the deed when the difference came up. Then she went out to her wagon and drove home. That's the whole of it. People will decide what you're worth by how you look right after the worst thing that ever happened to you, and they'll price you fast. And loud and wrong. Verena Kessler stood in a field of gold on ground they'd all called a grave, because she knew one thing they didn't, and she was patient enough to let the ground say it for her. If somebody told you that you were finished, back when you were only just beginning, comment first wheat below,